G'day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and we have yet another excellent interview happening now. And it is a particularly special one with one of my own old professors, Dr. Adam White. Doc, how are you going today?
Very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
No problem, no problem. And before we begin, could you give us a brief background about yourself, and perhaps also like why this topic, among all the others you could have done a thesis on, why you thought that was particularly important to chase after?
My background, did my studies at Alpha Crucis, what was Southern Cross, and then my PhD at Macquarie University. Looked at the educational background of 1 Corinthians 1-4 and the whole world of teachers and how that influences the divisions over I follow Paul, I follow Apollos. And as a part of that, I was looking at the metaphor of the rod. Should I come back with a loving spirit or with a rod? And made a case in my thesis that was probably some form of excommunication. And so that sort of got published later on as a separate article. And through a series of random conversations, ended up just pursuing it as a book idea. I really certainly wasn't intentional. It just sort of happened that way. And a couple of years later, ended up with a book on exile and excommunication and all of that. So, yeah, it was all a bit of a roundabout way to get into it, but it just became something that really interested me, and that's what the book became.
That's pretty epic. Yeah, it ultimately does come down to interest. Like, what kind of pain would that be if someone does a thesis on something they're really not interested in, and it just wouldn't make sense. Wouldn't make sense anyway. Exactly. But it is. I myself, even part of why I wanted to do this is that it does interest me too as well, because I'm loving to look into New Testament and early church ecclesiology. And this is an area I don't see. Like, I see all the debates in that about, what's the nature of a bishop? What's the bishop versus the presbyter? Blah, blah, all those things. But then just something as simple as, what's the nature of discipline? How is community cohesion maintained? That's something, it's something very basic, but not a very well beaten path in these kinds of online flame wars, to put it very nicely. So I think it's fantastic. We're gonna have this happen. And just before we do get right into the meat of it, I'm going to thank financial supporters right now in my, I assume you know your Latin fairly decently, Doc, in the Census Patronorum. I'm going to thank you to my financial supporters. You guys are absolute legends. You make this possible. And as is normal for Q&A, financial supporters do get priority for questions. So if there's a good number of them, you'll be guaranteed to get in there first and definitely guaranteed an answer. Thank you all so much for supporting me. Link down below if you want to, if someone is not supporting, but you're considering supporting or want to. And likewise, we'll be plugging Dr. White's book, which is also in the description down below. And so I reckon we jump right now into it. So the cool thing about your book, I see, is how you begin with just the nature of the ancient world. You don't jump right into the New Testament straight away, but just simply what's this cultural river they're operating in? What contextualizes what Paul says, what makes it significant from both commonalities and also from where it departs. So would you be able to give us summarize the overall nature of the citizen in the ancient world at the time of Paul and the time of Christ?
Wow. Where do you start? So, yeah, I guess the starting point to understand the individual is to understand what the community meant to people at any time in the ancient world. It's sort of a newer idea for us, sort of a post-Enlightenment Western idea that we place a lot more emphasis on the individual, and that can be traced back to sort of Judeo-Christian origins, but it's much more the sense of the individual identity, the self, who we are personally, as apart from communities, and there's almost a reaction to the broader community sense of, well, everyone's going this way, well, I'm going to be the individual and stand out from the crowd, and we celebrate that, and that's good, and that has a place, but that's all very new in the context of human communities and human behavior. So for all times, really, it was about community. It was about the group to which you belonged. The question was never, who are you, that we might ask today. The question was always, whose are you? Who do you belong to? Who's your family? And you're identified by your groups. And so Jesus, the son of Joseph. It's always who your father was, who your family is, where you're from. Paul of Tarsus. Your city identity. And so these groups are always so pivotal to who you are. They are what give you your identity. Who you ate with said everything about who you were, and the honor of that group, or the status of that group, you shared, you took part in, and so that you had a responsibility to uphold the group's identity, to uphold their honor, their status, because that reflected directly on you. And so citizenship was primarily, at least certainly the Greek idea, and it was in the Greek world that we really see this for the first time, more formally in Athens, where you are a part of a city-state. And so, the Greek world wasn't, like the country of Greece today, which is its own nation. You were part of a city. So Athens was a city-state, as apart from Corinth or from Sparta, or your identity was that you're an Athenian. And so to be part of Athens, you attained citizenship. At the age of 18, you become if you're free-born, if you're male, you could become a citizen. And with that comes the rights of citizenship, to be able to participate in the city, to be able to enjoy any benefits that the city received, any financial benefits, you could share in those, but it came with an obligation. You were expected to serve in the military. If there was a war, you're expected to take up arms and protect the city, and generally just to protect the honor of Athens. So it was a give and take, but that's what gave you an identity, but it also gave you protection. It gave you, you were secure within that city, and so citizenship for them was essential, because if you don't have a city, you don't have an identity. You don't belong. You're effectively dead. You're separated from your family. You're separated from all of that. So citizenship it's who you are. It's everything about who you are. So then, the Romans sort of adopt this idea. They introduce the idea of Roman citizenship, which initially begins, you're part of the city of Rome, because Rome was a city. It wasn't a nation or anything like that. It was a city. And so you have Roman citizenship, which is you're part of the city of Rome, like you're part of the city of Athens. But as the Roman Empire expands, what does it mean to be Roman now? Where Rome is covering the whole Mediterranean. You've got Roman citizenship, but that you may not have ever visited Rome. But because you're part of the empire, you have that citizenship, and it's the same sort of exchange. What you get for your citizenship is the protection of the empire. You get the privileges that come along with that, and particularly when it comes to matters of punishment, matters of justice, you're going to get a fairer hearing. You're going to get a proper trial. If you're found to be guilty of a crime, you're going to get a lesser punishment. But overall, just the protection that comes with being a citizen. So, and again, it's a mark of identity. So, in Paul's time, you can be a citizen of a city like Tarsus, but you can also have Roman citizenship like Paul did as well. And so it becomes sort of an identity marker, as opposed to someone who is not a Roman citizen. And so, you can see the contrast between, say, Jesus and Peter with Paul. We know that Paul was martyred through decapitation, which is a standard. If you're going to be capitally punished by the Romans, it's going to be that. But if you're not, you're going to be crucified. And so Jesus, Peter are both crucified because they're not citizens. So citizenship broadly is that. It's just, that's it. It's your identity. It's the group you belong to. And it really is everything about who you are. To not have it, and that's where the idea of exile comes into this. To not have that it's a fate worse than death, is to not belong to anyone.
Yeah. So from that, we can very easily see with citizenship today, obviously highly significant for like, let's say just for us Australians, for example, but also Americans and almost whosoever. Still very important, significant, but but probably not even in the same way as you describe with the ancient world, where that was literally everything about you. That was that was who you are. But then with today, it's largely a thing of like certain legal rights and benefits you can get. Otherwise, even if you're not a citizen, you can live fairly comfortably in communities in Australia, albeit with less certain legal rights and benefits and such. So unlike today, losing your citizenship, that would suck a lot. That'd be pretty bad, pretty serious, but not exactly the end of the world. Unlike back in the time of the ancients, and so that's why, as you would describe, such an idea like being outcast or being exiled would be just so devastating with them. And so with that, if that did come to be a thing with exiling from the city, what was the nature of that in that ancient period of being exiled from the city, from being found, I don't know, to violate city life in some way, and so grievous that you're found that you must be pushed out of the city? Like, what was that like? What was that whole process like for someone being pushed out?
Yeah, good question. Well, I mean, first of all, the reason why you would be exiled, if you look at Roman law is almost exclusively, or certainly capital crimes are always exclusively deal with crimes against the state. And so you could murder a family member of another family, and that would still be a private matter. But any crime against the state, anything that could be deemed treason, that's when the courts are really going to take an interest, is when you're actually going to be prosecuted by the state or something like that. Because a city was so essential to a person's identity, but it was the cohesion of the city that gave the city its strength. If you think about the Roman army, took off on a tangent. Why were they so unbelievably successful? It's because they fought as a unit. They didn't fight as individuals. They could turn up against any army anywhere, and the fact that you didn't even have to be a very good soldier, you didn't even have to be very big or very strong. It's the fact that you worked as a unit that made the army invincible, and that was always the case. Sort of for Philip's armies as well. The fact that they worked together made them unbeatable. And so there was this idea that in families, in any group, in any society, we only can survive if we are a unit. And the philosophers would describe this as a body. That a city or a group is like a body, and that we have our roles to play, and that we function. As long as we function in our role, then the city and the body is healthy. And so Paul just plagiarizes that in his own description of the Christian community. So this idea, it's all sort of wrapped up in this in a term. In the Greek, it's homonoia, where we get our word harmony from. So homonoia it comes from two words, homos and noia, same mind. And so to think alike, and that's the goal. So whoever you are, whatever you do, you need to be in harmony with everyone around you. It's not to say that you're all robots that all have exactly the same thought patterns, but you all share the same values, ideals, vision for the group you belong to. And in the Latin, it was the same idea, but it was the word concordia. And so where we get a word concord from. These ideas were so central that they became gods. In fact, it was one of the first gods that the Romans effectively imported from the Greeks, was the god homonoia. They brought that to Rome, translated to Concordia, and began to worship her as a god. In fact, in the Senate, the next to the Senate building in the middle of Rome was the Temple of Concordia. This was a central god to the very harmony of the Roman state. So Concordia, harmony, is essential. And so the most severe crimes are anything that threaten that. You can hurt another person, an individual, but if it's not a threat to the state, then you guys deal with that yourself. But anything that is treasonous, that undermines what holds us together, now we've got a problem. And that was true in any part of the ancient world, again, that being the most serious crime. So the question then is, what do you do with that when that emerges? And this really originates, well, in all cultures, going back to the garden. What happens when Adam and Eve are threatening the harmony of the garden? They're kicked out. I mean, this is like the first punishment. And it was always the primary punishment, because if the greatest threat you can present is to the group, well, then we need to deal with you as a group. We need to deal with you and remove the threat from the group. Go back to Leviticus. All of the punishments there are removing a person from the community, whether it be because they're sick and you don't want to infect the rest of the group, or because you've committed an offense and we remove you from the group, but we do it permanently. You are removed from this group called the planet. You're gone. Which, interestingly, apart from ACAN, it never actually happens. Just the threat of it being there, though, was enough to keep people in line. So any culture you go to, it's a case of we're going to remove you if you become a threat. What that means in reality was get the hell out, never come back. What you do outside the gates, we don't care. We're not going to punish you. We're not going to chase you. We're not going to just go. You are not allowed back in. That's your punishment. So your only hope at that point is to find another city that might take you in, and that can often happen. But you've still lost everything. You've been cut off from your family. You've been cut off from any means of support. If you manage to survive, get into the next city and still have food to eat, you're doing okay. But whatever happens is that you're out of there, and that is a fate worse than death. You're better off dying than to be cut off, because you are cut off from your entire life source. You will probably not survive. And if you do, who are you? You've lost your identity. You don't belong to anyone anymore. So you're basically a ghost. So that was always the case. Where this starts to become a problem is in Athens in the 6th century, where you've got these tyrants, these giants, as the Greek word means, who are constantly vying for power. The people with all the wealth and the influence, they're getting their bands of followers and they're trying to take the city. They're trying to take control. And so a tyrant would rise up and become the leader of Athens, and no one can resist them until somebody else comes along with a bigger band of supporters and they overthrow that tyrant. And in overthrowing the tyrant, you don't let them stay in the city, you get rid of them. So you kick them out. Well, that doesn't deal with the problem, because they just go out and they find other supporters and they raise an army and they come back and they attack the city and they go back and take their position. And so this is just going back and forth until the citizens are like, we're done with this. This is ridiculous. We just need to get rid of this whole practice. And so they institute a democratic process in creating the democracy. The thing that actually keeps the democracy together in check is this process of formally removing a person from the city. So like everything else, you do it by a vote. Once a year, there'll be a vote where you need a minimum of 7,000 ballots cast. And there'd be a couple of people put up on this particular vote. And the winner, if you want to call it that, gets kicked out for a 10-year period, where all of their possessions are kept in check. They're maintained, but they have to leave the city for 10 years. And then they come back after 10 years and they can start again without having any loss. Now, the idea of setting a 10-year limit on it is that it means that you know that you can come back. You're not going to try to come back by force. Mm-hmm. So you do a vote for this. A couple of people are put up for the election. Anyone who seems to be a bit hubristic, a bit tyrannical, somebody who's just getting a bit too big for the city, they're put up. So it's just even the threat of that is enough. Well, the way that you cast this election, this vote, is that you get broken shards of pottery, which is what everybody writes on, because it's lying around everywhere. And so you write the name of the person that you want to vote for, and then everyone casts their lots, and the winner, quote unquote, gets the prize of being kicked out. Now, those little pieces of pottery are called ostraka in the Greek, which is where I get our word ostracism from. And so ostracism becomes the formal process in Athens. Now, this lasts for the period of the democracy, about the next century. And we can see accounts then of all of these different people. And we've actually still found examples of the ostraka. You can go to Athens today and still see these pieces of ostraka that from these elections. So that's the process in Greece, and that becomes formalized there, in Athens. But in Rome, it's a similar process where if you are an elite person and it usually is only an elite person that is any threat to the city, and so they're the ones who are going to be brought up on the capital charge of treason. If you're brought up on these charges and you're found guilty, the way that the criminal system in Rome works is you've got a couple of days to go away, get your affairs in order, and then we're going to exile you. We're going to kick you out of the. Sorry. What we're going to do is we're going to punish you. We're going to kill you. And so it's almost like wink, wink, get the hell out of here, and we're not going to bother with this anymore. So the option you have at that point is I can wait around a couple of days and come back and get decapitated, or I can grab as much as I can carry on the road and just bugger off. And so that's effectively what happens. And the minute you do that, what they did is pass a law to say that you are forbidden from fire and water. So anybody found to be giving you any provision is themselves going to be punished. But there's no way to really follow that up. So effectively what that does is seal the deal. You've left. Now we're going to make it formal. You're going to be exiled. But there was never a formal process of exile. It was never written into the Roman law book. It was always just the inevitable outcome of any capital trial. But it's not until you get to the empire where it's becoming more formalized. This begins with Caesar, but it really gets formalized with Augustus. And the problem that you've got at that time is that you can leave Rome. You can be found to be guilty of a crime in Rome and you can leave, but everywhere you go is the Roman Empire, right? So it doesn't actually matter where you go. You're still in the same place. We can't exile you because we own the Mediterranean. And so what they do is to change the laws around to actually formalize this process of exile, where they send you to an island, because that's about the only place where you can't be looked after, because we own everything else. And so the process becomes more formalized. And this is why you see John ending up on Patmos. That's the standard procedure at that stage, rather than just kill everybody, which they would still do. But if you're a citizen, we want to avoid that. So go to an island and look after yourself there. And that's generally where everybody ends up, on these islands, until they run out of islands, of course. And then we've got another problem. But yeah.
That's epic and fascinating, and hearing that, because I remember like watching documentaries and then doing my own reading as well. Because when you described with the Athenian practice of like, okay, we'll vote you. If you're unlucky to get voted out, you'll go on, see you later. But we'll keep your stuff. We'll keep that in check. That's all good. But then I remember thinking, now hang on a second. Rome, on the other hand, they have this whole thing of proscription, which is kind of the exact opposite of that, if I remember correctly, where you'd not only sent, like, you it's not that you're going to be actively pursued, but if someone kills you, no one's gonna bat an eye, and they can take all your stuff. Was to give a little bit of a tangent, was that whole thing of prescription where like your life is forfeit and anyone can just take your stuff, maybe with like a bit of a portion going to the state? Was that common at all outside of Rome, or was that pretty special to
prescription? Yeah, prescription was something implemented specifically by tyrants. So the first major one you get is Sulla, who basically, there is a prescription on all of my political enemies, and you can kill these people with impunity. We own their stuff. You can keep a bit of it for yourself, but you can kill them. And so it really just becomes a mob. It's a bit like modern cancel culture. It's kind of all in on a person, and anyone can it's free reign on this particular target.
the end goal of cancel culture, yeah.
So the idea of it is to, number one, to remove a political enemy, and number two, to enrich yourself and the state on their wealth. But the fact that he did that is why he goes down in history as a monster. Is the fact that he implemented these prescriptions, because nobody agreed with them. And then the next major one you get is with Octavius and Mark Antony, after when they've basically united and said, okay, we're going to take the empire for ourselves, and we're going to enact this prescription on Brutus and his crew, and basically everyone else, because what they had done, the empire is totally broke at that stage. They've fought these wars, and the empire is just absolutely in shambles, and they just need to get the money back. They need to just get money, bottom line, and at the same time remove political enemies, guys like Cicero that have been speaking out against Mark Antony. And so it's kind of a double win. And at that point, it's just I think 300 or 400 people posted on a list in the middle of the forum. It's basically, you see these people, kill them, bring us their money, and keep a bit for yourself. So that's really what a proscription was. It was only ever used by tyrants in extreme cases, and no one ever went down in history as being popular for doing it. So in the sense of proper exile, it's a case of if you're wandering in the wilderness, you've got no protection. If you're not a Roman citizen, and if you've lost your citizenship because you've been exiled, we don't care what anyone does to you. So it's not a case of you're marked for death. It's look, you're just on your own, and we're not going to protect you. So whatever fate comes to you, well, you shouldn't have done it in the first place. You shouldn't have got kicked out in the first place. So they're kind of different things.
Yeah. And I'm kind of curious. I don't know if we know much or at all about it, but do we know what would happen if someone in exile, like their stuff's being cared for, but then they're in exile, they die in exile? What would happen to their stuff?
Yeah, good point. Don't know. That was in the Athenian case. Yeah, don't know. Well, I probably would have gone to the family.
Yeah.
The family was still there, so it all still belonged to them and their whatever titles they had. So yeah, I guess it would have just carried on in the family.
Yeah, I assume so myself. And my friend here says, because I can highlight comments here, my friend here says, been listening for 10 seconds and already fascinated.
Awesome.
And exactly, this is exactly why your lectures were my favorite back in college. They were like, you could go on and on and on and on. I'm just always like, oh yeah, wow. I'm never getting. I don't know if I ever did drowse off in Romans and Galatians class. I hope I didn't, because otherwise it was excellent stuff to listen.
You're too busy asking hard questions to fall asleep. So
that's true. And making essays where I totally go into arguing with other positions before actually exegeting the text. I think you know what I'm talking about.
I remember it well.
Oh man, I'm surprised I even got 60% for that. I'm surprised. I'm genuinely surprised. Sent to an island like Australia. I think we're a bit bigger than that. Oh man. Maybe we can look at a quick question here. Is Dr. White implying that these are the same / similar rules of actually we're gonna get to that. We'll this is about getting into Paul now, so we'll get to that. So, and this is exactly what we're going to be answering. So now I reckon we can just jump right into the main thing as well. So in light of all these fascinating issues of really the primacy of the collective, where like your individual rights, frankly, meant jack all if the community was at threat. Whereas today, individuals can have the legal and often cultural rights to really do whatever they want, even if it absolutely destroys one's local community or family and all that.
We live in a Western world where we're celebrated when we attack our culture. It's like if we tear down our culture, the more vigorously we do it, the more we're celebrated.
That's it. That's
the most unique thing about the West is that we're actually encouraged to critique ourselves and to challenge our politicians and to speak out against them and to mock them and do everything we can to try to humiliate them. And we're celebrated for it. We last 2 seconds in Rome with or in Athens with kind of behavior. It just astounds me. And yet we still say that, oh no, we live in such a tyrannical Western world. What are you talking about?
Exactly. You get your modern Westerner, they'll just march into Rome and start chanting Roma non magna, and everyone's like, what? It's just out of chaos. Even to the point, like slight tangents again, even to the slight point where like even sometimes in certain contexts, celebrating our home culture can be deemed as like bad and offensive. I even remember, I think I read some news somewhere where the Scottish government themselves, there was some Scottish holiday recently, I think, and they sent out some release saying how like wearing kilts on this day is racist now, which is just absolute clown world we live in, absolute clown world. But hey, maybe God willing, we can adopt Paul's principles and actually get some more sense, at least for the church happening. But now with that, we can look at how all this applies. So this context of the primacy of the community, and that look, if you do something really, really bad, see you later, we're heading off. And all this cultural river context with this ancient world, we can now look at. We now somewhat have a good idea of where Paul himself and really the beginning of the church itself was all situated in. And so with appropriate contrast and comparison with this ancient contrast, could you tell us what the nature of citizenship in the church was according to Paul, and his standards for discipline and the nature of exile that he describes or prescribes in? And you can take a good deal of time with this, because this is really like the main thing here.
Sure. Yeah. Well, everything that applies at the macro level of the state applies at the micro level of the family, and whatever group to which you belonged. So community, you can live in a city like Rome, which is 1 million people, and you can say that I'm a Roman citizen, but it's kind of meaningless when you're dealing with millions of people. It doesn't actually, it doesn't give you, it doesn't guarantee you immediate friends and immediate people to be in relationship with, which is what a community is always about. I mean, this goes back to a time when humans lived in little villages and you knew everybody, and it was a smaller community. That same idea carries through, but you're still looking for, you still want a community of fellow human beings to relate with, to talk to eat with, to actually socialize with. And so that's what sort of mini groups, that's where they fill the gap. And especially as the empire grows, and this sort of emerges through the Hellenistic Empire as well, where you've got this huge movement of people into different cities, and particularly slaves that are taken from their home city for 20 years, a slave on the other side of the Mediterranean. They don't even remember where they've come from, but now they're free. Who's their group? Who do they belong to? And so with this increasing sort of displacement of people around the world, you need to belong to somebody, and you've been cut off from your family for a generation, so you're effectively on your own. Well, who is your group now? And so you're looking for smaller groups to belong to, and so that can take a couple of forms. Usually, and we'll see in the modern world, we think about church as filling that relationship gap, which it obviously does. Well, ancient religion doesn't do that. You don't have the ecclesia of Zeus. Zeus is a god. That's his temple, and we do what he tells us to do as a community. But he doesn't provide a social life. There's no small Bible studies around Zeus. That doesn't.
No small Odyssey or Iliad studies.
Yeah, you just don't do that. That's not a reality in the temples. And so where are you going to find your group? Well, you got to find a group of somebody you've got something in common with. And apart from being a human, or a citizen of that city, what have you got in common? Well, it's going to be your occupation, because you're doing that 7 days a week. There's no weekends. You don't have, I've got golf buddies, or no, you work from the sun up to sundown, 7 days a week. That's your life. So those are the people you've got something in common with. And so what you generally find yourself in is a voluntary association. Now, we see these in Acts 19, where you've got these silversmiths who are in this, get into this huge riot. How did he gather the silversmiths together so quickly? Well, because they were his mates in their voluntary association. They were like a trade guild, like a union. And so they work together. They at least associate together once a month. They have a meal together. There's a whole group built around that. And what they share in common is a trade. And you find these all over the ancient world. For every possible trade, you're going to find these groups. And so that's what you sign up with. You pay your monthly fee. And for that you get their friendship, but you also get burial, particularly if you've got no family to bury you, and that's very important. You need that group to bury you. But also there's a meal. There's a celebration, just time to go and get drunk with your buddies. And so that's what this provides. It provides you with friends. It provides you with a community. And so that everyone's going to be part of one of these groups. Paul was probably part of a similar guild. How does he meet Priscilla and Aquila so quickly in Corinth? Well, he probably went to the local guild and found who these leather workers were, and got connected with those guys. So this is a really, really common thing. And what this does is that it provides a sort of alternate family, particularly for people that don't otherwise have a family. So that's, if you in the Greek and Roman world, that's kind of your go-to. In the Jewish world, you've got the same thing, only it's called the synagogue. So the synagogue isn't just where you go on Saturday morning to study Torah. It's your entire, the whole Jewish community of the town congregates there. It is the church. And it doesn't just fulfill a 1 hour a week teaching function. It's your whole life. It's where you go to, it's like a town hall or a local community hall in your local town. And it serves all of these different functions, but primarily what it provides for you is a community. So Paul is another good example. He goes to these cities, he goes straight to the synagogue. Why does he go to the synagogue? Because he's going to find Jewish people there. What else is he going to find with those Jewish people? Accommodation, food, protection, a place to belong. people to preach to. Every social need, every relational need that he has is going to be met in the synagogue until he's inevitably kicked out and he has to go find somewhere else to preach. Where does he go? Well, he goes to someone's house. He begins a network of house churches. What are they providing? They're providing community, because this is the fundamental need. I mean, humans have always had a need for a relationship. It goes back to the garden. God makes the man. He says, we're not finished yet. He needs a companion. He needs help. He needs someone to be with. So God makes the woman. That's a fundamental human need, and we've always had that. So these groups provide that community. But what they also provide is a legal structure. Because again, the Romans aren't concerned with private matters. They don't care about that. The Roman Empire, the entire Roman Empire, is at its peak probably managed by about 3,000 or 4,000 people. That's it. The whole Roman Empire. A series of governors and their slaves and the people back in Rome. That's the entire management structure of the whole Roman Empire. Now, that is dwarfed by your local council. And yet the Romans can still do more than our local councils can in a more efficient time. It's extraordinary. So they are not in the least bit concerned with local private matters, apart from capital offences which require death. That's the only time that they'll get involved. For everything else, it's entirely up to you guys to work it out for yourself. And so that goes down to the family level. If a family member is doing something that is a disruption to the family, that's threatening the stability of the family or bringing shame on the family, then it's up to the family to deal with the person. And the father has legal rights to kill a family member if they bring disgrace on the family. And that's what they're expected to do, because it's all about honor and shame. It's an honor-shame culture. So if you're disgracing the family, you're disgracing us, well, we're going to remove you. And if that means death, then so be it, because honor is far more important than your life, because honor is everything for us. And we still see this in cultures today. We still see the same kind of response. So for the Romans, that's that. They don't need a police force. You don't need a legal system and a police force to enforce Roman laws, because locals can do that for you. That's the point. And this is especially true in the synagogue. The Romans are more than happy for the Jews to look after themselves. Why would they want to be involved in that? Why would a Roman want to come into a synagogue and say, we're in charge now, we'll tell you guys what to do? I mean, how's that going to turn out for them? It'll be a riot. So you know what?
Pilate tried that once or twice.
Yeah, you guys figure it out. You know, so when they bring Jesus to Pilate and they say, you know, he's like, you do with it yourself. He's like, but we can't kill a person. Only you can do that because you're the governor, which is obviously what they wanted the outcome to be. We see this. Paul says, 5 times I was given the 39 lashes, the 40 lashes -1. What was that? That was a synagogue punishment. The idea being that if you found to be blaspheming, then there's a punishment for that. We either excommunicate you from the synagogue, which is a very extreme punishment, or we flog you. Those are your choices. So on 5 different occasions, Paul was given that option. Now, why 40? Well, why 40 -1? Because Deuteronomy says that you can only flog a person no more than 40 times. If you do that, you bring shame on the person and on yourself. And so they said, well, let's play it safe. We'll hit you 39 times. But it wasn't a guaranteed 39 times. What they would do is to measure you up, and they'd say, you're a big person, you could handle the full 39, but you might be a smaller person that can handle, we think you can only handle 20. The point isn't to give you the full measure of the punishment. It was just to make it very clear that you don't do that kind of thing. So the fact that Paul got it 5 times, and 5 times he got the 39, would suggest to us he was probably a pretty big guy. The fact that they could look at him and go, you can handle the full 39. But the fact that he went in,
you reckon?
The fact that he went in they went back in 5 times. He was given an option to be excommunicated, but that means he couldn't preach next Saturday. So he's like, well, just give me the flogging and I'll come back and I'll just keep doing what I'm doing until they eventually drive him out. So the point being that the Romans were very, very happy, and they expected people to deal with their own stuff. And the whole model of honor and shame was enough of a basis on which to stay in line. Because if you bring dishonor to your local voluntary association, you're going to get kicked out, or you're going to be fined. And until you pay the fine, you're going to be kicked out. And then you've got nothing. So you don't want to do that. The punishment of being isolated is a fate worse than death. So that's at everyone's disposal to use that as a punishment. So anyway, all that's a very long way to come around to this. Well, what is the church? It's an alternative to the synagogue. It's an alternative to a voluntary association. In a lot of cases, it's an alternative to a family, because for the people that are coming there, they might be part of a local voluntary association. That could be the case, and maybe it was in a lot of cases, but many of them weren't Jews. And probably in a lot of cases, maybe they didn't have families, but in a lot of cases, they were a family. But the point is, what they're doing is creating a community. They're an alternative community in a variety of options of communities. And so the punishment that you would expect there, well, you're not going to flog anyone in the church. And when Paul threatens the rod, it's a metaphor. But the practice of removing somebody from the group is absolutely stock standard to any group behavior, because isolation is a fate worse than death. And if you don't want that, don't screw around. And how does that look? Well, in every case, you can't come to the meal. You're not invited to the meal, because the meal is where you belong. It's where you participate. If you're not invited there, then you don't belong in the group. So the church is just doing what everybody else was already doing. It was inflicting a punishment that was just standard and had been since the beginning of time. They were doing nothing unusual to what anyone else was already doing at the time.
Fascinating, very, very fascinating. I like the comparison with the synagogue itself, because that does seem to be the closest analogy with how the church operates. As you said, there wasn't the ecclesia of Zeus, there wasn't the Iliad and Odyssey studies, but there was the synagogue. They did study the Torah, and the church kind of did carry that practice on. From what you've studied, how much do you reckon that the Christian churches ended up adopting from the synagogue versus what they adopted from the surrounding pagan culture in terms of just community practice and such like that?
Yeah, they were a bit of everything. The one group I didn't mention was the school, your local school. But very few people ever got an education. But if you wanted to draw the closest comparison to the type of group that the church was, they were a philosophical school. They weren't the synagogue in the sense that they had more Gentiles than they had Jews. And it certainly wasn't a place to come back and to rediscover your ethnic heritage. They weren't voluntary associations in the sense that they weren't just an occupation. They had meals, so did the synagogue, and on that point they have in common. They had membership lists. They probably had membership lists in the churches as well. They probably had contributions in the sense of, well, someone had to pay for the meals when the church came together every week, and that was probably just a weekly contribution that people made. So there are similarities in that, but at the content, or at the guts of it, what the church was doing was teaching you how to live. The voluntary associations cared nothing about teaching philosophy or what the good life is. They were there to get drunk and have fun. The synagogue did teach that, certainly, and did teach scripture in how to live this out and live out God's plan. But the ethnic exclusivity of it was certainly not what the church was about. And so in the sense that what type of group they were was much more like a philosophical school. With other elements as well, that certainly well, I guess the way that I put it is that they were a bit of a hybrid. They just took a bit of everything. They were functioning as a community like other communities were, but what they were trying to achieve was what all of these groups were trying to do in their own particular ways. But again, the primary thing being, well, what does it mean to live the good life, which is what all of the philosophers were trying to do for themselves. I forgot the question. Did that answer it?
Pretty much, yeah. But if you want to say any more,
I just didn't get it right.
Oh no, 100%. So the question was a bit of a long-winded question, I'll admit, but basically, nature of citizenship in the church, according to Paul, the nature of exile, and the standards. Actually, the standards for discipline as well. Is there much more to say about that, or that Paul gives about the standards for discipline, or did you kind of cover that pretty comprehensively?
No, really. Well, yeah. I mean, you've got examples where, like, Paul's threatening the rod. When they come back to Corinth, they're going to threaten the rod. Well, that would have been, I think, certainly would have been exile or excommunication for a period. In 2 Corinthians, where he's talking about the wrongdoer in 2 Corinthians 2, and he's saying that the punishment that's been inflicted on this person is enough. Now restore him. That would have been excommunication for a period as well. When Paul's saying in 2 Thessalonians 3, he's talking about these lazy people that are not contributing, not pulling their weight, is saying treat them, basically remove them from the meal for a set period. The difference between what Paul does and other groups is that in the case of and you'll see it in First Timothy as well, you see examples of excommunication taking place there. Even when Jesus, it all comes back to Jesus's warnings. Warn them once, bring the church, warn them, and then bring them up in front of the church and treat them as you would a Gentile. That's just excommunication at that point. What's different with what Paul does is that, well, number one, they offer warnings. And so Jesus has, warned them once and twice. There's precedence for that in the Jewish culture, but to give 3 warnings is quite new in that period. And so the idea being, we're going to warn you twice. And if you're still going to do it, we're going to get rid of you, because you've shown us at that point that it wasn't a mistake, that it is willful, and that you're not willing to change. If you've demonstrated that now by rejecting our warnings, well, then you are obviously a person who is actively working against the values of the group. Now it's time to get rid of you. But we're willing to acknowledge that it was a mistake or that you weren't aware. So let's not just jump straight to pulling the trigger and getting rid of you. So this idea of warnings is quite new, and that's really solidified in Paul's churches. But then, the idea of removing a person. So in the voluntary associations, if you don't pay your fine, you're told to you're not welcome to the group or back to the meals until you do pay the fine. So there's an easy way to get out of this. Just pay the fine or pay your membership fees, and then all of this will be over. In the Jewish community, but particularly we see this in the Essene community, where they'll say there's certain time periods of excommunication. So you do certain things and we'll excommunicate you for 200 days, but there's a time limit set to it. After, you don't even necessarily have to change. After a certain period, you can come back. Same with the 10 years in the practice of ostracism. But what Paul seems to do is that you can come back when you've repented. You're welcome back, but you have to first of all show us that you've changed. And so the punishment is expecting remediation. The guy in Corinthians 5, hand this person over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his soul might be saved. Now that's an extreme, it's basically like, hopefully he'll still be saved when he dies, because what he's been doing is horrendous. But again, there's this idea, it's removing you for a purpose, which is that we want you to change. And that seems to be the case, certainly in 2 Thessalonians 3. Same with 2 Corinthians 2. Where, he's repented, he's sorry. Now, before he's consumed by his grief, bring him back in and restore him and reaffirm your love for him. That, you made a mistake, but grace is bigger than your mistake. So that's, in terms of what Paul's doing, the warnings are really what is quite unique that he brings to the community. And the idea being, it's discipleship. It's pointing out an error to a person and saying, look, I'm assuming that was a mistake. Don't do it. Here's why it's wrong. Then see how they respond. And if it's just, stuff you, I'm going to do it anyway. Well, all right, now we're dealing with a different thing. Now we're dealing with a very different attitude that would need to be dealt with a bit more strictly.
Fascinating. And I have to acknowledge my super chats here. Thanks, Josh. Go Celtics. Cringe American sports, rightio. And that accent, there is 2 of them. It multiplies. Yes, my friend here is a great bigot against Australians. So, the more fellow Australians interview, the merrier. I hope it brings him maximum pain. No, I love you, mate. I love you.
Actually, yes, we have. You know the Australian accent. I don't know how true this is, but one explanation I've heard for it is because there was so much rum in the earliest community, and rum, there was no money. The rum was the money. Everyone was so drunk that it's believed that that's what developed the accent, which wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
I want to research that now, because if that's true, because I've always thought,
hilarious,
having like heard the voices of Indigenous Australians, that we kind of just adopted a fair bit of theirs and it combined with our English accent and we got what we have now. Because I think there's a fair bit of similarity in our accent with Aboriginal. So, but if the rum theory is true, I'm going to look that up. I want it. I'm going to be flat open confirmation bias. I want that to be true, and I'm going to find the evidence to make sure that's true, because that's. Well, okay, drunkenness is a sin, but come on, that's pretty funny. You got to admit.
Sorry.
Yes, 100% back to it. And so, what's cool with this is that we get a bit of a picture right now where churches today, they do technically practice things like excommunication and discipline and all that stuff, but it seems to give a very much more stark, almost political picture with it. How much would you say that the early churches, like even just from the hint of the use of the term the ecclesia, if that was, I don't know if it still had political connotations from well after the Athenian period, but like how much of a self-governing, self-sufficient political community would you say that the Pauline, or really just the early churches in general, were at the time of Paul?
What do you mean, like by political?
So basically in the way you describe, where they basically oversee their own, how would I say it, crimes, so to speak, conflicts, disputes, and all that between themselves, and then they sort that out. They may have their own kind of, I don't know, their own kinds of judges, whatever, whether that be the elders or the bishops and all that. To what extent do you reckon that was the case with the early churches? How political, quote unquote, were they, you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, it's really not that clear. They were concerned with internal matters, and that was probably the only point. Every group was only concerned with internal matters.
Yeah, that's what I mean by political, like self-governing, taking care of their own crimes, not relying on some external body to do it for them.
Yeah, there was the law. There was obviously Roman law, and Roman law was pretty well developed, and it was quite strict on a number of different areas. And what all of those connect back to the betterment of Rome. So that was always the case, and the goal of the job of the governor in any province was to maintain Roman law, to make sure that no one was a threat to the empire. But at the same time, local law also prevailed, and they were very happy for local law to prevail so long as it didn't conflict with Roman law, which was quite minimalistic in the provinces. So the whole governor's job was twofold: keep the peace, collect the taxes. That's it. As long as you're paying your taxes, and as long as you're not a threat to the Roman Empire, do whatever the hell you want. Govern yourself by your own laws, which is why in Jerusalem, Pilate's like, judge him by your own laws. You've got your own laws to deal with this. Go and deal with it. And they're like, no, but we want him dead, and only you can do that. And so that's where you see the sort of two different political things starting to conflict. So at the city level, say in Corinth, for example, there were city laws, but then Corinth is a Roman colony, so it's just Roman law done in Corinth. They don't have Corinthian law; they have Roman law because they're a Roman colony. Whereas in Jerusalem, in Judea, and Galilee, it's local law primarily, and just don't violate Roman law, which is not much. Just don't start a riot and don't form an army and fight against us, because that won't end well for you. So in that sense, at the city level, if you think about Paul's churches, their primary oversight is whatever the local city law would have been, and whatever attendant punishment went along with that. So don't violate city laws would be the instruction. Where we do see this one place of conflict is in Corinthians 5, where you've got this person who is violating Roman law, which is he's in a relationship with his stepmother. There's specific Roman laws against that. So it is a violation of Roman law. Now, how much that would have, even that law itself was a personal thing, it was a private matter. I mean, the whole reason why that law was put in place was from Augustus saying we need to have good Roman families breeding with themselves and creating good Roman children. So really it was only laws concerned with Rome. So when we come over to Corinth, it's less of a concern, but the law is still there. But it's only ever going to be prosecuted if a family member prosecutes the law, because it is a private matter. So in this case, you've got this guy in a relationship, young guy in a relationship with his stepmother, who probably would have been his age anyway, because most women die young, or when they die, you're only going to remarry a younger woman. So he's probably the father's probably remarried a girl who is the son's age. So the son and this stepmother, which is kind of like, could have been somebody he went to school with, for all we know, is now his stepmother, and now they've gone into this relationship. So it's an illegal relationship, and it's also it violates a lot of the moral expectation of you just don't go there. And so there's that sort of, that's why Paul says that even the Gentiles wouldn't tolerate this. Number one, it's illegal. Number two, even the moralists, the philosophers wouldn't tolerate this behavior either.
Yeah.
So he's doing that. But it is, now, the only way that could be prosecuted is if the father prosecuted it and dealt with it. Take the son to court, take the stepmother to court, which clearly he hasn't done for whatever reason. So the question is, how does Paul respond to that? Well, he doesn't respond by saying you need to take him to court. Doesn't even go anywhere near that, because, well, probably the guy's an elite patron in the church. The reason why he can get away with it in the church and they're sort of, sort of almost celebrating it, is that he's a patron. He's a wealthier person it's kind of like the person who funds your whole mission budget at church, and you kind of let them get away with a lot more because we don't want to lose their money, right? It's that kind of situation.
Yeah.
So they're letting it go. So Paul's response isn't take him to court, because they couldn't, because they were probably low status people trying to take a high status person to court, which would never happen in the first place. Paul's response is get him the hell out of the community, because if attention's paid to him, it's going to get paid to all of you. So you don't want that sort of attention. Get him out of there and make it clear you do not associate with those kinds of people. You guys repent of your behavior, which is to tolerate it in the first place. That's the really bad behavior. It's not the fact that he was doing this. That's terrible. But all that says is he was never a Christian in the first place. You guys that are putting up with it, you're the one that needs to be dealt with. And so the whole chapter 5 is dealing with the Corinthians, not with the man. He's dealt with in half a verse. Hand this man over to Satan. Done. Now, for you guys, you're the ones that we've actually got to deal with here. So in the terms of the political sense, they're not there to enforce Roman law. They're just there to enforce their own community boundaries, which is the whole point. We have a set of standards. You violate those standards, you're out. You violated these standards by tolerating that behavior in the first place. Because by tolerating it, you're affirming it. If you're affirming it, then there's a problem with you. There's a problem with your morality in this. And so this is who we need to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. So the way you describe it seems almost as if, so with like modern law, for example, with our idea of law, there's pretty much like one, in a way, overarching law, notwithstanding federal versus state. But fundamentally, that's law, and everything from communities under that is not really law. It's like policies or regulations and all that. But from what you describe, it almost seems like law appears with back then. It's not like that kind of a sharp distinction, but more of a kind of a cascading effect where you have, and it was very minimalist and like really just concerned with, and not totalizing like modern law, but simply like concerned with what they were concerned with.
We're completely different.
That's it. So like you'd have your national law of the Roman government and all that, and that wasn't super extensive. And then you'd have your law with the local city. But then it almost seems like these local communities, their regulations or policies were pretty much a law unto themselves, just next step down into the chapter. Would that be an accurate characterization for the church as well? Like they had their own law in a sense.
Exactly right. They have their own community standards. And if a member of the community violates the state law or the city law, then you would be expected just to disassociate from that person. Whereas this is why we're so very different, where a church in Australia is completely beholden to state law, 100%. And if, say there's a pedophile in the church and you know about it, and all you do is say, look, just don't come to church anymore. We don't care what you do. Just don't come back here. And you don't report that person to the police. Who's getting in trouble?
That's a crime. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So it's a completely different scenario. We're far more beholden to the state laws than what they were. And because, again, they didn't have a police force back then. The only people who could prosecute law was the person who had been violated. If they could afford a lawyer, and if they could afford a judge, they could prosecute the law. But in most cases, they couldn't. So you just carry on.
And I guess that pretty much segues right into the next bit of this, I guess. How would you, whether you want to summarize, we've got a fair bit of time left. So whether you want to summarize or go into as much detail as you want, how different is the operation and perhaps even the self-conception of the church community with Paul's time and under Paul himself versus today, and perhaps even appealing to our own direct Australian and Western context?
Sure. Yeah, I have thought about this since writing the book. I think if there was a difference, is that perhaps we're not as clear on what we stand for, what we consider to be our boundaries. What the whole purpose of these communities, or what defines a community, is that it had boundaries. There were things, if you talk about, in sort of modern social identity theory, you talk about the in-group and the out-group. And so you're an in-group member if you hold the values of the group, and whatever that group might be. And you define the out-group as anyone who doesn't hold your values or has different values. And this could be down to anything. Like you see, I'm a Penrith Panthers supporter. So I see a Penrith Panthers supporter, automatically I'm in the in-group. If I see a Parramatta Eel supporter, that's the out-group. Now, that could be a family member. That could be my brother. But the minute you support the Eels or any other team, you're in the out-group in this context. And so I remain part of the in-group so long as I say the Panthers are the best team that's ever walked the face of the planet. And if I say anything negative about them, I can expect to be booted from the in-group because I've violated the boundaries of the group, which is that the Panthers are the best, right? So you can apply that to every single situation in life, every type of group. And, if you're going to go off on a tangent, one of the challenges that social media has presented is that if you think about community when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s, before social media, it was your local neighborhood. And so what you held in common was you all lived in the same area. So you have a lot of different beliefs, but you would still find ways to make friends, even if you disagreed on points, because you had to live with these people. That you still had to go and play with them after school, and you find these points of commonality. Whereas now you can find somebody with 100% the same beliefs as you anywhere in the world, and they can be part of your community on social media to the expense of an actual living, breathing human being that you can have physical contact with. You don't need that anymore because you can find like-minded people to be in the in-group. And so then again, cancel culture and all these things that sort of immediately result from that. Yeah. So coming back to the church, or just to what we are, I think it's a case of what we might have lost. It's in a time like the first century where it is all about the community. Well, then you have to ask the question, what do we stand for? What do I? Because if the group is my identity, then I need to understand what you are so that I can identify with you, and I can actually even foster that in myself to be more a part of this group, to be more like what this group requires. And so you're always thinking about what does the group believe in, and therefore what is my place in that? So you have that idea. Whereas if I was to say the church today, when we talk about inclusivity, excellent. But for the more broadly we want to be inclusive, the less boundaries we can uphold. We have to be able. We have to say, if we want to be really strict and tight and very closed in the way that we define our community, great. We're going to have a really tight community, but we're going to have a very exclusive community. We can only have a very few people that could ever meet the ideals of the group. So the more we want to expand, the more we have to expand our ability to incorporate people. And the more we do that, the less we have to police, the less ability we have to be able to say to somebody, well, you can't do that because that's against the values of the group. Well, if we don't know what the values of the group are because we've just spent all of our time trying to get everybody in and we've lost all our values, it's impossible for us then to monitor it or police it or to, protect it, because we don't even know what it is to begin with. We've completely lost sight of what the group is about. So I think if I was to look at what we are today, I think that's the challenge that we have, where we've become so much about inclusivity and so much about tolerance. Yes, absolutely. Welcome home to church and whatever you are, come as you are. Absolutely. But then we don't ask the next logical question when you come in the door of, okay, what do you need to change to fit in? Because we don't even ask that question anymore because, well, that's almost discriminatory if we wanted to, if we sort of look at the modern situation. So I think I've answered the question, but so in terms of discipline, we've made it impossible for ourselves to even do the work of discipline because we don't understand who we are. And then even if we were to try to do discipline, we're in a culture that says, well, it's all about inclusivity and you could almost be sued. I mean, could you imagine if you applied Jesus' teaching? which says, okay, if someone does something wrong, go and talk to them privately. If they still do it, go and take a couple of witnesses with you. Well, now we're talking about gossip. Now we're talking about discrimination, defamatory sort of behavior. Then he says, bring the person up in front of the whole church and publicly humiliate them, shame them into repentance. That's literally what he's commanding them to do. Could you imagine doing that? Could you even fathom the lawsuits that will be coming down if you attempted that? You simply cannot do what Jesus commanded us to do. And
which is shocking when you put it that way. That's insane. Yeah.
Impossible. Totally impossible. So this is the situation we find ourselves in. But anyway, so the challenge, I think, for us is to, number one, to understand who we are. If we talk about inclusivity, absolutely, but at what cost to some of the teachings of the New Testament, which are very strict on particular issues of sexuality. Very clear on some of these things. And, we have to almost jettison these clear teachings in order to be more inclusive. Well, at what point do we stop being a church? Do we actually stop being the Church of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, just some social club.
Exactly right. And so we have to go back to Scripture and go, okay, what is it? What of these teachings can still apply today in this without getting a lawsuit? But what do we believe about this and actually hold to be valuable? And we always focus on the love and the inclusivity, but there was also love with, but you can't do a whole lot of these things anymore. You got to stop doing that stuff as well. And not because we hate you, but because you're doing something that's sinful and it's going to kill you. We want you not to die. So maybe stop doing that stuff so you can live a better life. So we've got to go back to that and then figure out who we are and what we actually believe. And then be clear on that you want to be a member of this group. Up front, you need to know what that means. And if that doesn't suit you, this isn't the group for you. That's how it is. And that's true for every club you could be part of. If you want to go be part of your local RSL or whatever your local football club might be, there's rules around it. There's dress codes. There's different things you have to comply to.
Yeah, you can't rock up to I don't know if the Panthers have their own like sports club or whatever. Like you can't rock up in
the West, but you rock up.
Well, given the stature of the Panthers, I wouldn't know. But but you can't just rock up into the Panthers Sports Club and start to say, I don't care about the Panthers. I quite like the Parramatta Eels quite a bit. It's like, mate, get out of here. What's wrong with you?
Right. There's rules. And so we have to establish that. We have to understand what we mean by that. And then be clear about that up front and be unapologetic about it. Be part of this group. And if you don't like what this group believes in, there's plenty of other churches, plenty of other groups you can be part of.
That's
the great things about being a democracy. You can go wherever the hell you want.
Yeah.
And if you're going to have those, then you need to go back to the next step, which is, all right, how are we going to police these? How are we going to keep these things in check? How much of these are we going to protect? And they understood this in the ancient world because it was all about community. There was no sense of the individual. There was no sense of come here and be whatever you want to be. No, come here and be what we are.
All your dreams.
or get out of here. Go find somewhere else to go. We don't care. Or if you are part of the group and you violate those rules, you're out. Bottom line, there's not even a question. You're out because it's all about protecting the group. And I think if I was to add the outcome of this, if we're so worried about including everybody, at what cost to the rest of the group?
Yeah.
Because for everything you endorse, for every behavior that you say is okay and we tolerate that, what you're doing is giving tacit license to everybody else to say you can do that as well. And so then we have to ask the question, well, what influences are we creating in the group that might actually undermine what the group is trying to achieve in the first place by allowing this stuff to happen? So do we actually lose the group in keeping the individual?
Yeah.
Well, that's a huge price to pay. And are we willing to pay that? Something we need to ask.
That's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful way to put that. Yeah, I don't know how much I can. I mean, of course, this is interviewing you, so I don't really need to add anything anyway. But that's like, even if I tried to, I couldn't really add anything much else to that, because that really is the state of the church in a nutshell. Quite a brilliant way to put it. And so to cap that off, in light of this sad and very unfortunate disjunct from the practice of really Jesus himself, but also in particular this case Paul, and that where they had, obviously, as you say, they had the idea of a certain kind of inclusivity on the grounds of ethnic lines, for example. So yes, come join the church, and not based on that. But fundamentally, they went along and really strongly asserted the common cultural idea of, we're a group, we have standards, this is our identity. If you don't like that, get out. We're not gonna change for your thing. And so in light of that, and how sadly a lot of the church has gotten out of it, and really, to give a personal idea, it's really shocking to me. But one little independent Pentecostal church I used to be part of, they had a very strong idea of out group identity. Unfortunately, in many ways it manifested was very, very bad, unfortunately, and it caused a lot of division and heartbreak. But ironically, looking back at it, it's like, look, the way they notwithstanding the errors they made, the way that they treated themselves as, look, we're believers, we're Christians, you're not, we're simply not part of the same group. And unfortunately, to the degree where even other Christians outside the group, but nonetheless, it's like, look, that experience was quite close in many aspects to what the early church was. We are this self-identifying group. We have this identity that we put ourselves towards. It's this standard that doesn't change for any of us. And if you're not for that, well, okay, we can go hang over there, I guess. And if you're in it and you willingly go against it, get out, please. And it's sad to see so many churches don't bother to practice that. And so with those standards that Paul gives, and how really many churches are failing. Thankfully, there are churches out there that are really trying to keep up this kind of thing, this kind of community thing, where it's not just the Sunday gather and then you go back to your regular life. Because that thing is the other major distinction, where the church was, and thankfully in many places still is, it's your whole life. You do everything that you do. You break bread together. You do everything your whole life together. You work together. You hire each other. Whereas today, often the church is just your glorified Sunday session. Maybe you go on your Bible study, but then otherwise you go work out and do your main life with the rest of secular society. But apart from that, given the church situation today versus what the standard that Paul and Jesus themselves gave, what do you think are the most important things? I guess you kind of answered it already, but I guess to make it more explicit, to give some dot points, what do you think are the most important lessons, teachings that Paul's standards can give to the church today, that the church really does need to learn today, and particularly if you can in Pentecostal church context today, both generally and in Pentecostal churches, if you can do that?
Yeah, wow. Well, yeah, Paul, I don't know. I can. There's 2 points really where he defines what it isn't and what it is. He says what this group isn't is we're not a group based on gender, status, or ethnicity. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free. None of those. All of those are qualifiers outside of this community, and they're essential qualifiers. Status as to whether you're free or a slave is everything you need to know about a person, and then gender and ethnicity, the rest of it. Just we're not about that. You leave those things at the door for whatever all of that's worth. But yeah, I suppose then when he's trying to define what they are, we're talking sort of the vice and virtue lists. Corinthians 6, where he's talking about these are the sorts of people that won't inherit the kingdom of God. Well, those are the clear things that you do these things, and those belong outside the group. And you are not just outside the group, but you're actually outside the kingdom of God, which this group represents. So it's pretty clear what he's saying about that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I come back to what I was saying before with where we are as a church. Pentecostal, perhaps, but maybe all churches where you touched on the Sundays. I think that's an important point where for most people, for a lot of people, perhaps church is just going to church on the Sunday. The community itself is just the people that are there for that 1 hour, but they actually have no other real value in your life because you don't see them outside of that 1 hour. And for good and bad reasons. So they're not actually an influential part. You don't identify with those people. You might more closely identify with the people you work with, or certainly with your family, or even the people in your street. Those are your community, people you go to school with, university. So those are your community. And those are the ones that you really belong to. And the church might be just that thing you attend to do your religious duty. So that is certainly one big area which is a hindrance to the church. And we don't help ourselves when we make church all about the Sunday. So long as you come to church on Sunday, you're part of the church and you're a Christian, and that's all you need to do. Well, it's not. That's not how Paul would have understood Christianity at all. It had nothing to do with just the meeting. The meeting was only the catch-up meal for the week of time spent together, because they were all families already. They were already close together already.
Yeah.
So I think we've minimized we set the bar to the absolute minimum for what it means to be a Christian in the first place. If it's just about going to church on a Sunday, sorry, that's not Christianity. Anybody can do that, honestly.
Yeah.
It's the church really encouraging or creating ways in which the members can be fully immersed in each other's lives and really be part of community. So, the Bible studies and the outings and these kinds of things. The challenge for that, of course, on the counterpoint, is that it's such a busier world where I live in Hazelbrook, for example, and I work an hour and a quarter away in Parramatta, and I go to a church in another town, and I've got friends, I've got different communities around the world. It's so hard for me just to make that my local church community my whole life, and to make that my set of boundaries. Almost impossible. And that's true for most people, particularly people with young families that are working and trying to raise kids. It's so hard to commit the time to a group that's required for them to be your identity. So we're really up against it in that way. So it's not just, it's an easy thing to say, don't just make it about the Sundays, but how do you do that?
Yeah.
That's a very difficult thing in the 21st century.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge thing. And so it's not even a negative. It's not even something we're doing wrong. It's just that we've almost had to set the bar so low just to give people something to grab onto. Because if you were to turn around and say you can't be a Christian unless 7 days a week you're fully devoted to your local community, well, that's a monastery. That's what you're saying. Well, no one can do that. So where do you draw that line? I think that's probably the key challenge. I think is where we set the requirements, the basic requirements for membership would be. I think.
I think what's unfortunate is, as true as with everything you say there, unfortunately, I'll personally encounter some people who'll basically take that unfortunate reality and then just use that as an excuse. Therefore, I'm just going to stay where I am, rather than considering that, since this really should be our highest priority, we should adopt the phrase, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. So even if it's really bloody hard to really get that consistent communal activity, and how would I say it? I'm trying to think of a certain word. Just community engagement in general. Just keeping a consistent community life, as hard as it may be, and you probably already strive with this anyway. Try to make it happen anyway, because of how super important it really is with the faith, and as it is nonetheless sad how busy, really, really busy it is. And one specific aspect I thought of a lot recently, which I think is something that churches could do now. And I don't think it would take like the biggest. There'd be some logistical hurdles at best, but like otherwise, it's something we could be within reach. Because what's your opinion on this? Do you believe, like with the Eucharist, particularly with the communion meal, that was in fact a meal at once upon a time back in the original days, and not just your little wafer and your little sip of wine?
No,
I reckon that's something we could 100% do. And that, because I think that shows the beauty of the union. It's not just like you take a quick wafer, take a quick wine. Okay, guys, see you later. But like, no, we're actually having a community meal and having that all together. What do you think? Do you think that'd be quite beneficial for churches to go for?
The Sunday service was, it was done at night because you still had to work, because Sunday was a work day, but it was a meal. Everyone, if you're in a community, you eat with the people that you're in community with. And who you eat with says everything there is to know about you. So when Jesus is eating with sinners and tax collectors, people freak out because they assume he's a sinner and a tax collector, because otherwise you wouldn't be eating with them. The question you might ask is, well, how does anyone know who you're eating with? Everyone knows who's eating with who. It's public knowledge, particularly in a small village. So everyone has that information. So the meal is the public declaration to say, these are my people. And the meal was a long procedure. It was a long process. You have your initial meal time, the course of the meal. You would then have a a devotion to the god, whoever the patron god was for that meal. Usually it's Dionysius, the god of wine and celebration. So what do you do in celebration to him? You offer wine. Everyone has a drink in honor of Dionysius or whoever the patron god or goddess of the meal was. Then you have the symposium, which is where basically the drinking party. Everyone's just getting off their face. And, the really high class symposiums would have orators and philosophers and jugglers and prostitutes primarily. It was a massive celebration. And that was the whole idea. It was to reinforce community. It was to say, to look across the table and say, we're one, we're part of the same group. So what does the church do? They adopt that whole model. Every Sunday they come together, they have a meal. Usually everyone would bring something to contribute to that. Then they would have the offering to the God, in this case, Jesus, wine, bread, as a part of that celebration. Then they would have a symposium, which wasn't prostitutes and wasn't getting drunk. Paul actually says to the Ephesians, don't get drunk on wine, but rather get drunk in the Holy Spirit. And then what do you do with that? Well, pray, sing hymns, songs, these different things. They'd read Paul's letters out. They would have a teaching. They'd read from scripture. They prophesy over each other. They would do the church thing, the ministry thing, but they do that every week. So the meal was you eat with the people who are your people. And so you come to this meal by being part of this meal. You're saying to everybody, we are one. So this is why Paul is so irate at Peter when he comes down from Antioch, and he's happy to eat with the Gentiles. But the minute the circumcised group turns up, he's like, I don't think I'm going to eat with you guys anymore because, I don't want these guys to think poorly of me. What is he saying to them? We're not one. We're not the same group unless you get circumcised. You get circumcised, it's all good. You stop eating that pork, it's all good. Till then, we're not really part of the same body.
Yeah. Unfortunate incident there. I think that particular incident makes for a lot of the arguments with us Protestants versus Roman Catholics. So someone will raise, look, Paul corrected Peter, therefore no Pope. But that's a whole discussion in its own right. But this is kind of an impromptu question, I guess. If you don't have anything off the top of your head, that's fine. We can jump straight to Q&A. But awesome thing about you're a very practical guy. You're not just some ivory tower academic. You live in your office and you live, breathe, and die there. You're practical. You actually do things with your hands. And again, if you don't have anything on the top of your head, that's fine. But in light of the whole, the unfortunate huge busyness of life, which does end up restraining many people to the Sunday service, do you have any tips or advice for how people can at least start the steps to making the church much more into the center of their lives beyond the Sunday service, even if they do have difficult circumstances?
Yeah, have some Christian friends.
That's good way.
Yeah. That you might be from different churches, but regularly meet in person with other Christians for the express purpose of discipleship, mentoring, iron sharpening iron. Yeah, absolutely. It could be people from your own church, but it is just regular. It's time. Any relationship, you can say, I've got this great relationship. Well, when was the last time you sat down and actually, had a coffee with them? A year ago. Is it really that strong a relationship? Because I'd say between now and then you hang out with a lot of other people. So that's it. That's bottom line. It's all about fellowship. It's being with people and find that community in whatever way you meet, with the express intention of saying, okay, let's be better at this.
That's right, yeah. And then grab at each other's necks, debating over the filioque, or maybe not that, but that's excellent. That's really the beautiful way to put it. Not much more else needed. It can kind of naturally evolve just from that basic premise. And that was awesome. I think that is the bulk of this presentation. Just pretty much borderline excellent lecture, just kind of divided up into multiple parts here. I think absolutely fantastic. Doc, thank you so much. This is pretty darn awesome.
My pleasure.
And now we're going to move on to Q&A. So again, supporters, if you're a supporter or if you give a super chat, you get first priority of questions. And so far I'm looking now, it doesn't look like we have any supporter questions yet or super chats. So I think we can just jump straight into normal ones. So here's an interesting one from a Romanist friend of mine, Alan Rule. Does Dr. White have a YouTube channel?
No, I don't.
You should.
I think, yeah, and I got one video there. I just needed someone to post it, so I set up a channel. So the answer is no. No, I don't. All my social networking is actually related to spray painting. So I spend my weekends spray painting cars. So I've got Instagram accounts for that.
Nice.
Not so much for this stuff. Yeah.
Maybe you should. I don't know. Maybe you should make a challenge, just like upload kind of lecture things, because like it's just like, wow, I can just listen to this all day. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. You can just keep going, going, and going. And this question was meant for me, but I think it'd be really good to ask for you because it's a really, really good way of distinguishing it. I think I might give a brief. Actually, I'll just let you, Doctor, answer it. Could you explain if being of the same mind means way of thinking or what you're thinking?
Yeah, way of thinking.
Yeah, so you wouldn't. So you wouldn't be like because like with a Roman Catholic, for example, or an Eastern Orthodox, really these more apostolic, quote unquote, kinds ones, faith is essentially assent to the articles of faith, these specific assertions, which we would, I mean, obviously we'd believe as well. You can't just say you're a Christian and then all of a sudden believe in Vishnu as your Lord and Savior. But I guess the thing of issue, like where with us, it may be like less of agreement on all these specific points and more agreement on certain basic points, but otherwise more so about the mindset and diversity on that is kind of okay and how it flashes out. Would you?
Yeah, look, it's both. It's definitely both. Look, you to be part of some sort of Orthodox community, you have to agree on the tenets of the faith. You have to agree on what you think. The way you think is more your personality. And so the way you think about how to achieve, we all agree on the same goal. We all agree that we're going to the same place. We might disagree on how we get there. It's not that one is right and one is wrong, but there's just different ways of looking at the same issue. So it is a both and. In every case, any relationship, marriage, friendship, whatever.
Yeah, that's it. I think a perfect analogy of an issue, particularly within Protestant circles, is the nature of like, we all agree that we are baptized. We baptize or are baptized for the remission of our sins. What exactly does that mean? You could get a full-blown baptismal regeneration view or a classical Baptist sign and seal type of thing, or a view I kind of don't really like myself, where it's just a mere profession of faith. But nonetheless, there's a point we do agree on, nonetheless. Although, of course, if you're in a local community, you should have a more tighter agreement. But I digress. This is an interesting one. So I think it had to do with the issues of context as well. Is Dr. White implying that these are the same or similar rules for excommunication? And I think this was when you were talking about the issues of exile and that in the Roman world. That these are the same or similar rules for excommunication that Paul writes about in relation to the church. If so, how should we understand this in the 21st century with thousands of disunified churches where excommunication from the church doesn't really work?
Yeah, this question came up before we've talked about the church, Paul's application of the broader culture. So I think we've answered that. Okay. Josh, let us know if you still need some clarification around that. But your follow-up point here, the disunified church and excommunication, that's a really good point, because if you're if you are kicked out of your local church, well, you can just go to the church down the road, because those pastors might not even know each other. Or you can go to your local mega church and hide in amongst the thousands of people that are there at every service, so no one would even know who you are, what you're about. You could be anything you want in that huge community. So that's the other challenge that the churches would have to implement any sort of excommunication, because it's just pack up and go to the church down the road. In fact, it is the same as what the Romans' attitude. Look, we don't care where you go, just get out of Rome. Go to the city down the road. They'll have you. Fine, we don't care. Just get out of here. And so that's as far as we would ever really get with ever being able to implement this stuff. So that's another really good challenge, I think.
Yeah. Would it be more accurate, because Paul he's not writing these encyclicals to like every church in the world or anything, but to a specific community? Would it be accurate, at least in most cases, to say that when Paul talks about kicking someone out of the church, he's not per se thinking a Roman sense of the universal body of Christ?
That didn't exist. No, they were local house meetings. So when Paul says to hand this man over to Satan, kick him out of the Corinthian church, there was only one church of Corinth. That was it. There was no Protestant or Pentecostal church in Corinth. It was just one small group of maybe 100 people, and everyone knew this person. And more than that, everyone in the city would have known too that this guy had been kicked out of his group. The word would have got around, and so it was much easier to do that when there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah. And then the East-West schism happened, or actually, no, even earlier. Once parallel jurisdictions start coming up.
I always joke that I saw after the end of the first century, I lose interest. Yeah, whatever that history was. Yeah, wasn't
that's kind of me, but upwards to like, okay, so like 1st and 2nd century, those are like my highest interest. 3rd and 4th century, yeah, I'm still quite interested. And then beyond that is like, no, I don't really care a whole ton anymore. Even though I probably should. But that is interesting, because I think with how many, because of course my channel is very often involved in like Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant dialogue and going at each other's throats. So some questions may come with that kind of idea back in the back of their mind, because I think that is a pretty underappreciated issue, whether Paul is talking in that kind of a Roman sense of kick him out of the universal body of Christ, or just kick him out of the local church. That's what he means by the church. And that seems, because like, I mean, I think he does show the concept like once or twice, I think, of the idea of the universal communion. But the primary sense he tends to use it, I think, from what I see, is like the local body here, which makes perfect sense. So sorry, Catholics, you just got debunked. No, well, kind of, not really. I don't know. Okay, this is a deep one. How does this relate to the atonement, satisfaction, and citizenship in the kingdom of God or New Jerusalem? I think this was happening when we were talking about citizenship in the church, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, like membership in the church, citizenship. So so small essay required for this one, but as I guess as brief as you're able to make it.
Yeah, it looks it's tangential, but you actually you hear Paul talking about citizenship in Philippians. Now, so think about Philippi being a Roman colony, 110% loyal to the emperor. And so when Paul talks about, remember that your citizenship is in heaven, that is a direct challenge to your citizenship is not with Rome. You are a Roman citizen, yes, sure. Paul was too, but your primary citizenship is the kingdom of God. And so he's already alluding to that sort of language then. And so then the question becomes, what does that mean? So this maybe comes back to the idea of the universal church, but is certainly not what he's referring to. But it is this idea of we're not just part of some local trade guild, we're part of something that is eternal, heavenly, something foreordained before the beginning of time, the continuation of the people of God. It's such a bigger, we are the true fulfillment of the Old Testament. All of those things is what Paul's saying. Your little group, when you families get together and have a meal, don't forget what you're part of. It's not just you're having a meal together. You're part of this thing that is eternal, that is the God of the heavens and the earth is ordained this. So that's where your citizenship belongs. That makes sense to a hardcore, devout Roman citizen who says, no, Roman citizenship. Think, when Paul's in Philippi and they say, these Macedonians are saying, they're advocating customs that is unlawful for us as Romans to do. So for them, it was all about their Roman citizenship. And that had started to take on a bit more of a cosmic significance when the emperor was a god. This is a universal empire. This is a cosmic empire endorsed by the gods. And so what Paul's doing is competing with that. You think the Roman Empire is big because it stretches up to the gods. Our empire, our community stretches up to the God above all gods. So that's the bigger thing you're part of. So I guess in citizenship in the kingdom of God, the New Jerusalem, at least in Paul's understanding, that's what he's sort of describing as a direct competition to the Roman citizenship and what that means in the first century, which we didn't really talk much about, but I think you probably understand. I don't know if that answers the question there, but that's
a lot. To be fair, I think addressing atonement in a much greater detail than that would probably, how would I say, that probably end up spawning a whole lecture series in its own right. Oh man, I had to answer Joshua now because I think he just became a supporter. So thank you very much, man. Excellent stuff. Interesting question. Would you say that the closed communion of the Catholic/Orthodox churches, I'll add Lutherans as well, they do that, or at least confessional Lutherans, are a better model for Protestants to follow, i.e. have to be confirmed as a member of the church before taking the Eucharist?
Yeah. I think in principle, yeah. You sit down at a meal is to say, I'm part of this group. If you're an outsider, welcome, but you can't share in this meal. And you wouldn't be there anyway. You wouldn't be in the group anyway. But what the meal represents for Paul is a weekly rebaptism. So you're baptized in water, and then the meal every week is a reaffirmation of the baptism. And so only those people would ever be seated at the community and be part of that. There might be sort of allusions to outsiders coming in and being part of the meal. It's hard to say. But certainly for anyone, they would have understood you eat here is because you're part of this group. And we are affirming your membership in this group. So the model of you can't have Eucharist or have communion until you're part of the group, or at least saved, I guess is what I would say. You're a Christian, that should be at least a minimum requirement to participate in that. But I joke all the time, I'm so glad I'm not a pastor to have to make these decisions. This just reminds me of why.
It's like, you'd be like, hey, how's it going? I hope you enjoyed the service. You can't join communion. Sorry, mate.
Hey, welcome. So glad you're here. Coffee's great afterwards, but can't have that cracker, buddy.
Can't partake in the body and blood. Sorry, mate. Sorry about that. This is pretty much, I have to agree with it as well. Like I pretty much really align myself with this kind of model. Not precisely, because he'd say only those in the Lutheran communion, but one of my Lutheran content maker friends, he says, yes, we're closed communion, but if someone comes to us and they give us like documentation proving, hey, we're this other pastor also in our Lutheran communion, he vouches for me, I'm all good. Then it's like, okay, cool, you can come in and partake. And I'd personally adopt that kind of thing as well, only not just Anglican, for example, since I go to an Anglican church now. Actually, I go to St. John's in Parramatta, so there you go. The nice big traditional church there. But so I highly agree with that as well. Awesome. Thanks a lot for your answer. And thank you for asking, Josh.
No worries, Josh.
And are there any others? I do believe we have that. Okay, what does Dr. White think of NT right?
I honestly haven't got into much of his stuff. If you can't see the books that are behind me, but they're all just more history. Just sort of classical literature, or if you can sort of look over here, just a shelf of commentaries. The first top four, those bottom three shelves are all just Corinthians commentaries, and then up there is all sort of classical literature. So books on ancient education, ancient philosophy. So all to say, I haven't got into a lot of Tom Wright because it's much more. I think it's a bit more theological. That's fine. It's just I've got excellent, what am I looking at here? So at the moment, I'm just working on a paper on Corinthians 5, and so this is something I'm working through regularly. That style of book is more what I spend my time reading, and then in my just sort of my hobby reading, I guess I'm reading at the moment The Last King of England, so the biography of King George III. So I kind of like American history as well. So I read a lot of history, I guess is my answer. So I don't have a lot to say about Tom Wright because I just haven't engaged with a lot of his stuff. But what I have seen, it's like, it seems pretty good. But I'm certainly not going to die on a hill over it. I'd rather go paint a car.
That's epic. I so relate with that. Most of my investment when I'm putting stuff into books, it will be on history stuff, not so much theological books, although I will every now and then, and particularly primary sources. But that Loeb collection there kind of puts my stuff to shame, far out. Yeah, a lot of it's just totally disparate collections of what I got. But that's awesome. I love that. I love that as well. And I think next, probably get to this anyway, but how do we adapt this to modern society, especially things like lawsuits against brothers? I think we kind of covered this a little bit.
Although that is an interesting one because the lawsuit.
Yeah, lawsuits would be interesting.
That was an interesting situation because the fact that they're taking each other to court is counter to how we would approach a legal situation. The case that they're dealing with is just a lawsuit. It's not actually a criminal offense that's been caused. And so Paul is saying you should be dealing with this in the community because that's one of the areas where you should be regulating because it's a dispute. The way you would use courts wasn't even necessarily to prosecute crime. It was actually far more about just shaming the other person. I don't know this whole Amber Heard, Johnny Depp situation that's been going on about than it was about anything else. Yeah. And so you use courts to publicly, even if you think about a lawsuit, you try and sue somebody, even if you've got no grounds to sue them, the fact that they've been sued that's the point. The fact that everyone knows it, you bring someone up on a charge, and even if there's no evidence for it, you stigmatize them with maybe they could have done that, and they're kind of tarnished now, even though they've got nothing to do with it. They're now tarnished by the fact that someone's taken them to court over this thing, and there'll always be this doubt now over that person. So that's how you would use law courts if you're really being quite cynical about it. That was exactly how they used to use the courts in the ancient world. It was elite people having an argument, and so they go to courts, and what made it even more prominent was the fact that the courts were done outside in the middle of the forum. So you go to the middle of the city, and the seat of judgment was literally a public seat, and everyone who was out shopping or doing their business that day watched the court case. So it was about publicly embarrassing this person, even if they'd done nothing wrong. So the problem in Corinth is that's exactly what they're doing. It's one person trying to embarrass a brother in public court. Now, Paul says the fact that you're doing this against a brother, because you never take a family member to court. Why? Because you shame the whole family. So you would never do that. It's absolutely forbidden to take a sibling to court. Absolutely forbidden. Paul says you're doing this to a brother. So how does that apply today? Well, it's how do you talk about other Christians on social media? That's the point. Because that's what the old ancient social media was. It was in the public courts. It was in the town square. You were humiliating a person publicly for the purposes of humiliating them in front of people who've got nothing to do with your community, rather than do what Jesus said, which is take them aside privately, deal with it behind closed doors. That was his command. They were taking it to the public courts. And so how do we adopt this in modern society? Look, if someone is a criminal, you take them to court because they need to go to court. But if you're just doing something to embarrass a person the same way that these people were, then you're the sinner. Sorry to say it, you're the sinner.
Fascinating.
And hence why, notice that chapter, what does he say at the end of that chapter? Wrongdoers like that will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, as will all of these other people, including, and this is where we get the only reference in Paul to homosexuality.
Far out. Fascinating. Very fascinating. It's and his other comment was the other really fascinating one, because you don't really see his kind of language where I think it's in that same section where he says you're basically letting the outside world judge us, but we're the ones who are going to be judging angels one day. So that kind of language you only see in like hyper charismatic circles, but it's true.
This is going to some woke mob and saying you deal with our theological issue. What the hell are you talking? What? Yeah. You're not just making yourself look stupid. You're bringing us all down along with you. Please get out of the church, because you are not part of the kingdom of God when you start doing that.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. Crazy times we live in. Ideas and terms like brothers, fathers, sons, fellow workers taken from guilds and professional associations in some passages? Oh, okay.
Great question. No. They sometimes, hey bro, hey man, how you going? That's sort of usage. No, it's very intentional. Very, very intentional, in fact. Because the most important group you're part of is a family. That's your whole identity is in your family. You are Jesus, the son of Joseph. So the fact that Paul intentionally uses sibling language is because what he's trying to bring into his group is the most intimate bonds of affection that were imaginable in the ancient world. Even though it's metaphorical, the implication is you have to treat them as though you would treat an actual family member, which is with the highest priority.
Yeah, that's very, very much the case. The family analogies are like, turn to any page of the New Testament, you'll find something about families in there.
Very intentional. Yep.
What are some potential issues with implementing smaller life groups, and what can be done to avoid those issues? So a very, very practical question.
I'm not sure what sort of issues. Which one are we? I've stated.
So he's asking what are some potential issues. I think this is with when we were talking about, like, when you talked about, look, just gather with your fellow Christian man, disciple one another. I think that might be what he's referring to. So he seems to be asking what's some potential issues that I guess you could see with that, and what can be done to avoid them.
If you're out there, Reformed Presbyter, if you maybe just add just a bit more of a qualifier as to implementing smaller life groups, what can be done to avoid these issues. I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question, to tell you the truth. Just implementing smaller life groups.
I think like pretty much what you described earlier is like outside Sunday service gathers with other believers and discipling one another. I think that's pretty much what he thinks about that.
if that's the case, I mean, just top of my head. I think that what you're striving for is a group of people that you are in community with that have deeper shared values than just your football team, or so there's something that goes a bit deeper, but there's something that is built around actual physical relationship, actual, human contact, rather than just someone you're friends with in the other side of the world via social media. So you're actually creating genuine community as was intended right back in the garden. So that's what you're going for there. And so then I guess the issues are, what do you do when there are conflicts? Perhaps would be a key issue of different beliefs. Well, how would you avoid some of that? Well, you don't necessarily, but you at least you come together around some core shared values. There's the hills that you'll die on, and then there's the other stuff which is just good for fun for conversation. You at least establish the core. These are the things that unite us, and these are the things that are the non-negotiables. And then when conflict does arise, because we know what we believe in, we know how to handle the points of conflict, which we can at least maybe agree to disagree and go, you know what, we can still be part of this group and disagree in this matter. And that's the strength of the group, would be, I guess, what I would say there. But, if you're coming together in a smaller life group, you're at least agreeing that the Bible is the word of God. We can at least start from that place. And the fundamentals of the faith are a starting point. So I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but that'd be kind of how I'd interpret it.
He adds the example of, can smaller life groups lead to cliques or tribes within a larger
community? Yeah. No, that's a great point. That's inevitable, totally inevitable. Particularly the bigger the church, the smaller the cliques, and the more that becomes your actual church. So yeah, 100%. You can't avoid it. If you're a really healthy church and you've got great life groups, you're going to grow. The church is going to get bigger, and you're going to become more atomized. So if you're the pastor of that church, then you're trying to do bigger community things. You're trying to keep all those life groups connected back to the larger identity of what the church is about. But you simply cannot avoid it. And in a sense, you've just got to keep it at a healthy level where, so long as I would say the leader of the group needs to be thoroughly connected in with the broader vision of the church, that can then feed that back into the group and actually help take the bigger abstract vision of the church and sort of tailor it to the needs of the particular group and to the age of the group, the gender, whatever the situation might be. Help it to filter it into a more personalized application, but with never losing sight of what it is, this bigger thing you're part of. And because the minute you lose that, what you get is the us v them. I love this life group, but I hate the church I'm part of. The minute you've got that, the whole thing just falls apart. You've just cut your finger off, and it's just going to wither away and die at that point. Yeah,
100%. And I think that's pretty much all we have right now, and just about to hit the 2-hour mark, which is very good. Because, you still have a little bit of time before you got to hit it. And so Doc, this is excellent. I'm hoping people who sent the questions, they were well satisfied with the answers. Because not every day we get someone like Dr. White in here. It's Dr. Adam White, not Dr. James White, because just to make sure there's not confusion with that. But yeah, this is really excellent presentation, excellent answering questions. So Doc, seriously, this is epic. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And would you like to plug anything of yours before we finish up?
I think you've put the link to my book there.
Yeah.
Look, it's just one of those bloody expensive books that we'll probably put you to sleep when you start reading it. So, but if you want to have a go at it, I'm the worst plug for my own stuff. But it's there, and go for it.
You should start a channel and start arguing with people online like I do.
Yeah. I'd rather paint a car. But
absolutely, real life stuff. Actually,
personality, man. Personality.
Fair enough. It's excellent. Well, Doc, thank you so much for coming on. Everyone who's come to watch, both now live and in the future, thank you so much for watching. This has been Dr. Adam White. This has been the other Paul. I hope you all have a lovely and blessed day. Have a good one.